Ahí sí, ahí. Okay, so I'm going to talk about extractivism and when we're talking about this is allows us to understand first what we usually tackle, especially for the different material. And they're talking about a little bit about natural resources, where the main purpose is to export them, and also how they use that. There is an important branch that is important because it is not that they have extractivist view, but we see in all of that, the historical framework, we see so many colonial dynamics, and they are usually the countries from the southern countries that provided these raw material, but the processing still happens in the center of that capitalist world. And that's a very important point. And this is and where the extractivism is occurring, these are mainly areas, rural areas in the global south that we can also know many times as sacrifice areas, that the transformation, consumption, and the ownership of those natural resources are occurring in different zones. However, another particularity of the Colombian context is not that there's only extractivism around carbon, but also we have um, another type of state that is in the first economic dimension. We're talking about rents, because the country and society are deeply intertwined with the ownership, creation, and how these rents are distributed. And there is a social and political dimension of all those relations. These are being developed around all these resources, and not to think how these rents are being done, and other resources for economic growth. So in the Colombian case, the social and political practices is focuses on the rents that we have, or the revenues that we have. And this is focused mainly by the state. And this is not only impacts the political and economic sphere, but also the social and cultural dimensions. This can be impacted in the sense that the standards and behaviors of society move around all these issues. And then they will have to understand how to make decisions about how those revenues should be distributed. And these can create some inequalities. Extractivism does not occur alone. This has been planned processes in Colombia, and this is one of the main points that I would like to tackle. For that purpose, we have an example, which is this is actually located in the northern part of Colombia. And this tells us, and this is how we ended up in extractivism for Colombia, particularly carbon. And these started before the 70s, when they had these, they always talk about that we need for the development of progress and growth. And they do not only talking, and they were always looking for these void areas. And this could happen with, and to understand which were the territories and how they were. Andres. And this is help making for us to change the political views, and people who have participated in the process of bringing the carbon policies in Colombia, and then they started having so as I was saying, there were several characteristics in the political processes that took to turn this into a standard and to have a political initiative and a framework that were, it was very difficult to back up when deciding this. And that was the pivoting doors, as we called it. So when we analyzed this, we saw that the time that we had to develop the policy was very short. And the public servants that were in charge of this, they were not well educated and prepared people with the knowledge about the sector. And they were negotiating with large companies with a very different knowledge about operations. And these led to very rushed decisions without the basis of good studies. And I think that the third issue here is that it is also turned into the national discourse or speech of the government. So these led to several political initiatives that were reflected in concessions for several years, but especially with these public concessions, because remember that when we started investment, it was considered part of these areas were considered part of the state, and also we had the declaration of public interest. Some from this part that they assumed that they were going to bring progress, development, and growth. And that was one of the tools that enabled the expropriation. In context, the next slide, please. The context tells us that our policies have bring about different results, unlike Germany. That was one of the things they said in Germany, large scale mining of carbon that brought progress, but we are in a very different context. This was a context in which the country had a lack of savings, internally speaking. And something important is that this raw material, which is the carbon, we were not an important consumer for this. So the costs were something where we could not create any type of influence, that we depended completely on the market, the external market. Another key issue in this context is that we had a very centralized constitution, different from the current one. And so we made decisions in Bogota without linking the territories where these projects were going to be carried out. Next slide. Okay, so the result is the huge debt. Colombia had credits and they indebted huge. So for this reason, they had to stop financing the industry and we had to finance it because all the budget was prone to cover that debt. So then we started to create other types of economies, because this type of economies is where I don't have any type of productive activity. So this is what we call the enclave or spot economy, where they were going to extract the carbon, and all machinery was important. So the carbon, since this is exported, it was never used in the country to add any value in the country in a significant way. Therefore, that region, what they did was just import and export without creating any type of chain or specialized work that could be bigger and that would bring value to the area. And this led to something additional. We began to be more and more indebted. We could not create any industry along this around this for local growth. And the only way to pay those debts was with the revenues of the carbon. And since we were indebted as a country, they were expanding more and more the extractive frontiers because they needed more revenues to pay the debt. So this led for violence and forced displacement to become practice in a common practice in the country. So we saw how the dynamics of power created. So we have these groups that were against the law that supported this type of displacement and a lot of corruption because everything that moves around that area is only around the revenues that I get from carbon. Therefore, being in politics, it provides me a power to handle the economy of the area. So what I wanted to say with all this is that first, that the just transition is an opportunity that we have. It's very unique to transform this development model that were imposed, but also the extractivism and revenues are not the only options. This was planned, but we can also plan something different. So we can see here that in terms of extractivism and this type of revenues, many people have analyzed this. In extractivism, it's quite interesting because I know that there's a lot of work to do. But one of the biggest parts of this approach is how to start not depending on that because we depended on this type of economy, which was very complex, and how to prioritize around the usage of the natural resources or how can I relate to the ecosystem. And also it's a reduction. It's not only to continue the same pattern of consumption and production. Something interesting is that there's always a proposal to change that concept on how humans relate to nature, especially in the context of this climate crisis, and how to change paradigms such as natural capital towards a natural equity, among others. And I think that one of the biggest characteristics is that we are focusing on these branch on overcoming that paradigm that is the development and to question the entire current system in the capitalist world. This idea focuses on the transition, and this should be from the system and not necessarily within the system. When we see the proposals of the post-revenue economies, that these are more structural, but the structure as economic and productive of a country or an economy. So how to overcome that dependence on the raw material? By promoting more industry that would add value locally to agriculture, services of greater added value, but hand in hand with a change in that fabric, fiscal, social, cultural, social, political, that is not focused only on revenues and then distribute them. Another example is how to work in the institutional capabilities and social political capabilities and to change these rent or revenue economies and extractivism. So what we see here in this field is that they are focusing mostly on structures or changes that keep happening within the system, unlike the post-extractivism. So one of the thinking is how we can reconcile these two large areas of work and how to make this just transition because they are both immersed in this fabric. It is very interesting from the post-extractivism point of view that they are more transformational, especially in social environmental issues. And also the economies in the post-revenues, these have a more materialistic approach. And here we have the proposal of the work as a proposal to be able to bring together these themes on how to make decisions on how we distribute the loads and benefits, not only in social terms, but also environmental ones. And how are the property forms, but hand in hand with industrial strategies that will allow me to see how can I create added value locally and greater productivity, but by changing this economic basis of dependence that we have. And I know that this is going to be discussed later on. And to wrap up, in the Colombian context, there are some starting points or initiatives that we have so far is from the policy and industrial strategy. Since last year, we have COMPAS, which is the national policy of industrialization. This policy is not extractivist, it's just a policy that is focused on several sectors. But as you know, this is just started as an initiative, and then it derives into the actions that are going to be implemented. And this touches this important point of being able to boost to more productive economies that will add value locally, and not just to be the basis of those global chains as we have always been. And in terms of democratization, I wanted to stand out at the work that we already are carrying out in Colombia of community energies, which is very interesting. And this is determined as diversity of practices and self-supply of energy related to the life plans of the communities to assist their real needs. So in many ways, we're talking about the ownership and the use of what we're working on. But something interesting to bring to this space is another initiative that the trade unions for energy democracy are using, which is like a global group. But their argument is that we wanted to reach to a democratization of the property, as we see in the first example, but to make the changes in the times that we have. And this can be a short period of time because the financial conditions and all conditions are actually very complex. So we need to bet on this project, and there's not going to be enough time to do that. And something additional that goes hand in hand is to work in public roads and public services and that need to be restored and not traded. These public services not only understood as energy, but that offers services to society, and they have to work in favor of the society and not just for the investors or shareholders. There's also the direct public property of the means of production and the technologies or the models of procurement, which are much more simple that we have worked with so far. So I like that the part that I like is that those resources that are exploited from the companies are going to favor the community. And here, the trade unions have a very important role to boost this type of changes within the companies, and also through public property, we can create these changes in several directions. And here we just have to stand out that there are many companies of the state that have been short in many ways, and but we need to understand that the size of what we need for that just transition. And with this, I am just finishing up my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'm going to give the floor to my colleague.
Okay, can I go? It's fine. Yeah. Okay. Today I'll talk about why this just transition opportunity is a unique opportunity for the Global South, and why in particular countries in Africa and Latin America have this unique opportunity to truly decolonize our economy, the process of transitioning to a new energy system, but also a sustainable society. And that's why I call this a Global South strategic repositioning. I'll start with okay, I'll start with highlighting this report that we published recently. I have a few copies here in English if people want to take them. This is a report that was published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which was convened by Dr. Yuba Sukona, who's the former vice chair of the IPCC. And what we tried to do in this report is to provide a long-term, comprehensive, strategic vision from an African perspective, but really from a Global South perspective, that simultaneously links climate, development, and energy policies. And these usually these conversations tend to be isolated. When we talk about climate, we don't talk about development, we don't talk about energy. So in this report, we try to put the whole comprehensive vision. And the main message that I want to start with in this conversation is that if we in the global south don't have a long-term vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we are already part of somebody else's vision, whether it's China or the US or Europe. And it's important to recognize that every economic bloc has every right to have a vision for itself. And they have every right to use economic diplomacy and incentives to nudge and push everybody to where they want to see them on that map. But so do we in the global south. We also have the right to our vision, and we have the right to use our economic diplomacy to position ourselves as sovereigns, as equal in this new multipolar world that we want to create. So it's very important to recognize what the traditional role that has been imposed on us during colonial times, during post-colonial times, and recognize that this is the role that we must escape. This is the role that we must decolonize, as that'll show in a minute. That's okay. So traditionally, during colonial times, we were imposed a particular role, which can be summarized in four major points. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world to buy cheap raw materials. Number two, we're supposed to be the place where technology and manufactured goods from the industrialized world is dumped into our large consumer markets. So we're supposed to consume their industrial output. We're also supposed to be just a nice low-cost tourist destinations. And that's a part of the traps that we have in the global south. But most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global north is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and technical assistance and job creation. But effectively what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain in the hierarchy of the industrialized system. And that is a structural colonial trap that was imposed on us during colonial times. And unfortunately, in the last 70 years after independence for many of our countries in the global south, and this cannot be the same role that we continue to play moving forward. So the process of a just transition must include decolonizing and changing the historical role that was imposed during colonial times. And with that, I want to start with three core messages that I'll explain in the next few slides. Number one, and this is very important for the just transition framework, we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. I'll explain what I mean by that, and I'll show you some of the data to show why we're still in a colonial role. Number two, similarly, as Nadia was referring to earlier, we cannot democratize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. In other words, we can have the best constitution, we can have freedom of speech, and elections, and transparency, we can have the best president and prime minister in office. But those individuals, that government, cannot deliver to the democratic needs and aspirations of their people. Because when they're in office, they recognize that their economy, the economy that they govern, is steered from abroad, is controlled by outside forces. In other words, the external debt pressure that we continue to struggle with limits the economic possibilities, the economic sovereignty, military sovereignty of our governments. So we cannot have a true democracy in a system that's still economically colonized. And similarly, for countries who want to de-dollarize the global economy, we can't de-dollarize without decolonizing our economies. And I'll show what I mean by that. So first, let's start with what are these colonial structures that have been imposed on us to this day. I'll show you the data for Colombia. I can show you the data for almost every country in the global south to illustrate this. Of course, one of the most important constraints we have is external debt in dollars and in euros. But this external debt is actually a symptom of much deeper structural issues. And these are the colonial structures that we need to unpack and undo. And I can summarize them in three major categories. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, manufacturing deficits or value-added deficits. So let me explain what I mean. When I say energy deficits, I include the biggest oil exporters in the biggest exporter in Africa is Nigeria. Nigeria today is energy poor. Nigeria doesn't have enough electricity for its people. Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline from abroad. The biggest oil exporter. After Nigeria, we have Angola. Angola today imports 80% of its gasoline. Mexico imports 50% of its gasoline from the US. And this system of energy deficiency is by design, it's not by accident. The rules of the system are designed to create energy poverty in the richest countries in the global south by design. And I'll come back to this. Food deficits. Africa today imports 85% of its food, 85%. When we used to be in, less than a century ago, we used to be the major exporter to the colonial powers. We used to be the breadbasket. And that's not by accident, it's by design. What is the design? It's the rules of international trade that were immediately changed as soon as the African continent became independent. In 1955, when the Europeans were building the foundations of the European Union and the Treaty of Rome meeting, Europeans said, we have a food security problem. We're dependent on Africa. We're dependent on the global south for our own food security. So they started a process of heavily subsidizing agriculture to produce wheat, corn, soybean, cooking oil, all the major food security items heavily subsidized in Europe. And that started in 1962 with the European Union Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is in place to this day. Of course, it wasn't just Europe. The US did the same, Canada did the same, Australia, Japan, and the former Soviet Union, which is Russia and the Ukraine today. That's why they dominate the production of wheat and corn in the global economy. And that system of subsidies that was introduced in the 50s and 60s forced our farmers, who couldn't compete with cheaper wheat and cheaper corn from the industrialized world, they forced us to specialize in cash crops for exports. Coffee, tea, tobacco, bananas, everything that we export today. So today we live in a world in the global south where we consume what we don't produce and we produce what we don't consume. I'll give you an example that will resonate with you probably here in Colombia. Ethiopia. If you look at Ethiopia's exports today, the biggest export revenues are coffee, and Ethiopian Airlines, which is a big airline. And then after that, it's flowers for Valentine's. Ethiopia today has 20 million people who are dependent on food aid from abroad. 20 million people. And yet the biggest share of Ethiopia's agriculture is flowers. Why does Ethiopia continue to export flowers instead of producing food for its people? Because they need dollars to pay the debt. The debt trap is part of this. So the last one is the most important one. The type of industrialization that we were allowed to have in the global south is the kind of industrialization where you have to import the machines, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, and we even import the packaging. So what we export from our industries is low value-added content. And what we import is high value-added content. So as we accelerate our exports, we can double, triple, quadruple our exports. We're always locked at the bottom of the global value chain. That's a structural trap by design. So you have these three core deficiencies: food, energy, and of course, no country can function without food, without energy. And these are our big deficiencies. food, energy, and manufacturing deficits, they create structural trade deficits year after year. And of course, with the trade deficit, our currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with the weaker currency, anything I need to import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, all imports become more expensive. So we literally import inflation. And when you import inflation in food and fuel and medicine, you have potential for social unrest. So our governments immediately move into a defensive position. So we subsidize food and fuel to protect the most vulnerable, which makes sense, but it's not a long-term solution. And we ask our central banks to try to stabilize the exchange rate, defend the exchange rate. How do they do it? Central bankers borrow more dollars to stabilize the exchange rate and therefore feed the debt cycle. So we're not going to get out of this trap, these colonial traps, unless we invest directly in these three deficiencies: that is food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, especially renewable energy, which is our biggest potential, and a different kind of industrialization to escape the bottom of the value chain. That's the transformation that we need to insist on in order for us to have a just transition. And the good news is that all of this economic transformation that is needed to decolonize our economy also happens to be climate solutions. Because food sovereignty is investment in agroecology. That's climate adaptation. Energy sovereignty, that's investing in our biggest potential, which is renewable energy. And industrialization to manufacture not products for other people to consume, but to manufacture the building blocks of what we need in the global south, which starts with energy infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure. This will create hundreds of millions of jobs using the resources that we have, the critical minerals that we have. And that's economic transformation, but it's also climate adaptation. So that's why the just transition framework must include the process of decolonizing our economies. And I'll show you some of the data in the next slide, just to illustrate. I'll show you the Colombian data. I can show you any country from Africa, as a matter of fact. Let me hide this one more time. Okay. Okay, this is Colombia's exports. This is the composition of Colombia's exports. Notice this number, Colombia's exports of $53 billion. Notice the composition, as you're familiar, it's a lot of raw materials. It's a lot of coffee and flowers, right? Like Ethiopia. And it's a lot of low value added assembled products. And I'll share the slides with you so you can see the data. And I'll send you the link so you can see the full data. But notice now, I'm going to switch. Notice the volume of imports, Colombia's imports. So exports is 53 billion, imports 75 billion. Colombia, like most of the global south, has a structural trade deficit. Notice the composition of Colombia's imports: pharmaceutical products, refined petroleum products, and high value added manufacturing. So the result of communication technology equipment. Yeah. Now, the result of this structural trade deficit, which is not in 1 year, you can go back with the data for decades, it's part of the system. The result is that the value of the currency is getting weaker and weaker and weaker relative to the dollar. And notice, this is data since the 1990s. Yeah, I'll admit more people, why not? So notice this pressure on the exchange rate is not related just to the Ukraine conflict or COVID or the global financial crisis. Yes, those things matter, they're important, but there's something much more fundamental that doesn't change. I can show you this data for Kenya, for Tunisia, for Egypt, for South Africa. It's the same picture, the exact same colonial system of extraction. And of course, the flip side of this pressure on the exchange rate is the increase in external debt. Our central banks have to constantly borrow to finance. And when you borrow in dollars, now the lenders dictate your economic policy, dictate your priorities. And when they dictate what they say, don't invest in health, don't invest in education, don't invest in all the things that will actually allow you to decolonize your economy. So keep reproducing the same colonial structures. And the fact that most of our countries are in a debt crisis today, when for decades the World Bank and the IMF dictate our policies, means one of two things. They're either incompetent in their policy advice, and we should kick them out, or it's intentional entrapment that they dictate. I think it's intentional entrapment. Either way, we need to completely dismiss, decolonize the process of policymaking away from the policies of the World Bank and the IMF and these institutions. So, and going back to the question of why can't we invest in our priorities? It's because our export revenues, this is Colombia's export revenues, sometimes up to 30, 40, 50% of export revenues go to pay interest on the debt, external debt, to continue the entrapment. And this is not unique to Colombia. I can show you the picture for Ethiopia, for Kenya, for Malawi, for the entire global South is a colonial trap. Now, let's take this to the global level. Divide the world in global North and global South, 2 blocks. And then let's keep track or net out all global financial transactions, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, interest payment, debt relief, climate finance, illicit financial flows, remittances from workers, all transactions. The net amount is the green line, which the last data point that we have is $2 trillion moving from the global South to the global North. $2 trillion from the poorest countries to the richest countries. This is the process of colonial extraction that never stopped. It continues to accelerate. Look at that green line, it continues to accelerate. So the global economic architecture that produces this result is the economic architecture that was introduced during colonial times. So why are we expecting different results when the process of colonialism was designed for extraction of wealth? And it is working perfectly based on what it was designed for. It is designed for extraction. So if we don't change the rules of the global economy, that number, $2 trillion, in the next few years will be 3, 4, 5, $10 trillion of extraction of wealth from the global South every year. So what is this global economic architecture that we need to decolonize? It has 4 basic pillars. The financial architecture, that's the IMF and the World Bank. The rules of international trade and investment, that's the World Trade Organization, that's the WTO, and it's the international taxation architecture. And we've made some progress in the last few months. The international taxation architecture, we're in the process of decolonizing it, thanks to the vote in the UN Tax Convention in November, with the work of the Africa group voting as a bloc, and thanks to the work that Colombia did to bring the Latin American countries with the Africa group, with the G77, to finally take the rules of international taxation from the hands of the OECD countries to bring it into the UN Tax Convention system with one country, one vote. So that process is happening now, decolonizing taxation. We still have to decolonize the international financial architecture. And I don't think that's going to work because we can't transform the IMF and the World Bank when the US has a veto power. It's just not going to happen. So what we need to do is build parallel architecture from the global South to dismiss the existing colonial architecture. And then the biggest blind spot in this whole process of decolonization today is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Nobody's talking about decolonizing the WTO. And that process is also about changing the rules of international trade, building new trade architecture from the global South based on new standards. And that's where the struggle is. That's the wrong one, right? Okay. Let's summarize where we are in terms of climate finance, because we're talking about just transition requires a massive amount of finance. In terms of climate finance, we have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction, from the global South to the global North. Then we have from a promise of $100 billion from 15 years ago that was never delivered. And whatever was delivered was mostly loans to continue the entrapment. Then next to it, you have the Green Climate Fund, which the last replenishment of the Green Climate Fund didn't even reach $12 billion. And then finally, should be a tiny little dot that's not showing there. I don't know why it's not. Something, the computer is overheating, I think. Next to it, if you look at the slides, there should be a tiny, tiny small black dot. That's the loss and damage fund that was created at COP28. $700 million, millions, not billions. And that's the summary of climate finance. 2 trillion moving in the wrong direction, and then the rest is crumbs on the table, with mostly entrapment for more debt type of mechanism. And I always ask people to please find me a single climate fund on this planet that can match the annual profits of these. This is a joke. It's not even funny that we call this climate finance. We're not even close to bringing enough financial resources for a just transition. And yet we have all these meetings and conventions, and it's all like tranquilizing drugs to keep people tranquilized as they continue the same process of greenwash, rinse, and repeat, as we say. I'm sorry, the actual picture is not showing properly, but I'll send you the slides. Take a selfie with it and send it to your climate negotiator. So here's climate finance. Okay, so summarizing climate finance in simple terms, we have a very simple principle that some countries, the global north, have exceeded their carbon budget, and our countries didn't use our carbon budget. So from a scientific point of view, countries that have exceeded their carbon budget, they owe a climate debt. Climate debt that should be paid in cash, in transfer of technology, transfer of life-saving technology, emphasized, and in the form of debt cancellation. That's how climate finance should be. But if you think of a climate debt or any debt, if I owe you $100, I'm supposed to pay you $100. That's not very difficult to explain. But instead, here's how climate finance works. Instead of paying me $100, instead of paying you $100, instead I'm gonna say, I'm gonna give you $3. And I have to tell you what to do with it. It's exactly what they do. They give us $3 and say, you need to do keep KPIs and reports and transparency and don't be corrupted. And I get to tell you exactly how you spend it. Your own money, $3. And then I feel bad, $3, you really need more money for just transition. So I'm gonna lend you $7. And also I tell you what to do with it. But I feel bad, so I'm gonna lend you the $7 with low interest rates, noblesse oblige, as the French say. And then I'll give you another $10, but you have to give me your forest for carbon credits. Right? This is exactly what they're doing. Carbon credits is supposed to be the biggest thing in climate finance. And then I'm going to invest another $8 in your economy, but you have to produce green hydrogen for me. And I'll dictate how you use it. And you have to de-risk my investment. And then I'll invest another $12, but you have to manufacture with green technology products for my market. And CBAM is the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a new tool of colonial entrapment. Because the way this works is that European countries are now investing in green industrial zones in Africa and in the global south to use low-cost labor, to use green hydrogen and cheap electricity manufactured in the global south, extracted from the resources of the global south, to produce products that are then sold in European markets without paying the border tax, the carbon tax. So it turns out that all of this green industrialization in the global south is still locking us in the bottom of the global value chain. It serves as an inflation management tool for the European economy to bring in cheaper products at low cost without paying the tax. It's a trade weapon against their competitors, because their competitors, they have to pay the border adjustment tax, the carbon tax. So all of this talk about green industrialization of the global south, greenwash, rinse and repeat colonial entrapment. So when you look at the summary of climate finance. Remember in the beginning, I'm supposed to pay you $100, but instead I do all of this as climate finance. At the end I say, well, wait a minute, I'm not supposed to give you anything. You're supposed to give me $100. These should be the terms of climate finance negotiations. And yet we see our presidents and prime ministers going to COP to negotiate how much the interest rate should be on these loans, to negotiate how much investment we should get from Europe, to negotiate all the tranquilizing drugs that they serve to our presidents. Instead of our presidents going and saying, we are not giving you anything. You owe us a debt. You have to pay. With transfer of technology, with transfer of financial resources, and with debt cancellation. And the problem is that that's not what our leaders do. Our leaders go and say, can you please make the interest rate lower, slightly lower? We can't pay this much. And we keep paying for crumbs. And we need to change the terms of this conversation because everything they service is more market-based solutions, more tranquilized drugs, more entrapment mechanisms. And that's what we need to expose. So the structural solutions, as I highlighted earlier, need to be global South, united front, cooperation for strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology. That's a climate solution, but it's also economic transformation solution. Not food security, food sovereignty. Food security is a colonial term that they invented in the 50s and 60s to tranquilize us into this position. Because food security means you secure the nutrition of your people, either by producing the food yourself, or by buying it, or by borrowing money to buy it, or by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers. They can't compete with food aid. That's exactly what food security means. Today, you hear it systematically. The French Ministry of Agriculture is called Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty. And when the French talk about food issues in the global South, they talk about food sovereignty in Europe and food security for Africa and the global South. They know exactly what they're doing. It's not by accident that they switch words. They know the system that they created and want to continue. Renewable energy sovereignty, according to the International Energy Agency, the last report from last year, Africa today, with existing technologies, not with future technologies, can produce by 2040 1,000 times our energy needs, 1,000 times. That's how much potential we have with existing technologies, not science fiction, new technologies. And that's how much of a threat we are if we become this energy powerhouse. This is beyond what the oil and gas industry has ever done in terms of economic development. And that's why all the investments that are coming to Africa for renewable energy, all of it is for exports, almost all of it. Not for African development, not for access to the 600 million people today in Africa who have no access to electricity. All of it is extracted. And then finally, strategic investments in a different kind of industrialization that allows us to escape the bottom of the value chain. And as I said earlier, the good news is that we have all the materials that we need, the critical minerals, to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, to manufacture and deploy clean cooking infrastructure. In Africa alone, we have 950 million people every day inhaling toxic fumes, mostly women and children, because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure, and clean transportation infrastructure to link our economies. Not everybody with a Tesla, but with public transportation, mass transit, high-speed rail that we can manufacture in the global South. Just these three industrial policies can keep us busy for the next 3 to 5 decades with millions of jobs and completely transform our economies. And that becomes the foundation of a just transition. And that is the decolonization we need. And of course, as I said, decolonizing the global economic architecture that I mentioned earlier has to be part of this process. And look at the critical minerals, the strategic minerals, where they're located. They're in Latin America, in Africa, Asia Pacific region. This is our biggest opportunity to completely turn the table politically, not just economically. And this is what I call the bargain of the century. And I'll close with this. So what is the geopolitical bargain of the century? We usually hear Europe has a plan for Africa. You know, the US has a plan for the global South. Today we're saying the global South has a plan for the global North. The global South has a plan for the global South on our terms. So how do we do this? When it comes to climate action, we can actually do climate action with $0. We don't actually need climate finance from the global north. How do we do it? This is where the political opportunity is. All the materials that we need, we have them in the global south. We pay for the materials with our local currencies, not with dollars. The labor to manufacture and deploy these technologies, we have in the global south. And we pay for it with local currencies. As blocks of countries with joint ventures, and central banks know how to stabilize exchange rates with different currencies. What we lack, this is the missing piece, the manufacturing technology. This is the manufacturing technology that was always denied to us. And this is what we need for this transformation. The one country in the global south that managed to industrialize, despite the fact that the rules of the system made it impossible to industrialize, is precisely the country that violated all the rules of international trade. That's China. Reverse engineered everything, copied everything. The few other countries from the south that were allowed to industrialize up to a certain point were allowed to industrialize for geopolitical strategic purposes. That's Japan after the war, Germany after the war, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea. These are countries that were allowed transfer to technology to industrialize up to a certain point. So who's going to give us manufacturing technology? Who's going to transfer technology and do joint ventures on our terms? Is it going to be the US, the EU, Japan, China? This is the opportunity for us in the global south to form an unbreakable alliance of a critical mass of countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We don't have to have all countries, but at least 30 to 40 countries to build a critical mass. Design our industrial policy with the entire value chain of manufacturing, renewable energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. Then go to China, which is the country that has all this technology and the most likely to engage in this bargain, and offer China an opportunity within 10 to 15 years to double its industrial footprint globally, to solidify its access to critical minerals, which is very important to China and to the US and to everyone else, and to double its geopolitical weight in a matter of 10 to 15 years. But they have to do it on our terms, not on their terms. Transfer of technology, joint ventures to build, basically replicate the industrial manufacturing base in the global south, distributed across countries. Why would China not take this bargain? They would jump on it immediately. And as soon as we trigger this process, we don't actually have to finish the process. As soon as we trigger the process, we immediately have a second bargaining chip to go to a country like Germany and say, we want your wind turbine technology on our terms, joint ventures in the global south. And if Germany says, no, we don't do transfer of technology, say, okay, we'll go to Japan. Maybe Japan will give us technology. Japan will say no. Say, okay, we'll go to China. China has the same technology. We'll give China another opportunity to increase. And then we go to high-speed rail, and we go to manufacturing technology for everything we need for the building blocks of our economies. And that allows us to reposition the global south geopolitically and economically in a new multipolar world on global south terms, not on Chinese terms, not on American terms, not on European terms, global south terms. And we have a small window of opportunity for this in the next few years. And if we miss it, we're going to miss the next several hundred years. And this, once you do that, then debt default becomes possible. Climate reparations becomes possible because you have a political position that allows you to impose what we want to see, which is a new international economic order, which is this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of this work from 50 years ago when we were decolonizing our economy. All of these ideas existed, but there was no united front to impose this, and we didn't have the geopolitical opportunity that we have today with China particularly in this position. So to conclude, the time to act is now. The poly-crisis that we're dealing with requires bold, urgent, and radical action. Radical, I mean, in the literal sense of the term, radical as in going to the roots of the problem. Because if I'm not going to the roots of the problem, I'm operating at the surface, and that's what we call superficial intervention. We don't want superficial intervention and tranquilizing drugs. The mainstream climate finance policies are too weak, too slow. They don't even work, which makes them dangerous economically, politically, socially, and ecologically. And as a result, a realistic plan for this type of structure transformation and decolonization requires, as I said, decolonizing the global economic architecture. And this global South strategic minerals opportunity that we have to recognize that it's a unique leverage point for transformative economic diplomacy and rebalancing of the global geopolitical map. And when I refer to Pan-Africanism or global South unity, it's not nice things we say to each other in meetings. Of course, it's nice to say these things, but you have to recognize that global South unity is an economic and geopolitical necessity. It's a prerequisite for this type of transformation, for a just transition. And then finally, I believe that this type of transformative vision is not only possible and desirable, but it's also affordable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you for being concerned about our perspective. And now we have in the framework this data that Fadel has explained about the Global South and these terms of energy transition and how the transformation should be done in the economy, thinking that economy is not just a mathematical result, but this has a very different conceptions of the world, the politics and others. We have always said that economics goes beyond the numbers. And this is also matter and energy, and the perspective that we have from the Global South, from feminism, ecology, and political economy are fundamental to think about expanding the way we are tackling these issues. So thinking about this perspective in this second moment, and now we have, I don't know if you have any presentations. Okay, we are going to close here. Okay, we're going to move the laptop so that the translation can be clear. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity of being here. Sorry in advance because yesterday I was not quite clear that what I had to do exactly, so I don't have a well-structured presentation as I would have wanted, but I'm going to share a few reflections and I hope that this can be useful. I live in Spain. Right now I live in the rural area, but most part of my life I have lived in a city that well, Catalina and Fadel have made these wonderful presentations, and I wanted just to make a few comments as from what we are living back there, and also to put forward some things about how to think about just transition. First of all, I would like to say that Europe right now, we're going to see how this is going to, what's going to happen, but they are getting ready for war. I think it is important to point out, since the Russian invasion upon Ukraine and what's going on in the Strip of Gaza, what is happening is that most part of the countries are starting a new dynamics of investment that has impressive dimensions, huge dimensions. And I believe, as from my point of view and the point of view of political ecology, that although we cannot say that the conflicts because for resources are the only main problem, they are in the heart of the problem, indeed. The invasion upon Ukraine imposed a great problem with the access to gas, and in France with the nuclear hubs, and also the high prices of input like fertilizers or cereals that help feed livestock, intensive livestock. And this has also imposed a very important movement. And I'm saying this because the European Union, after COVID-19, established a plan for post-COVID reconstruction that was called green, because the European Union calls everything green. If you have nuclear energy and also gas, natural gas energy, and in the end, the European Union called all these green for 5 years, and in the next 5 years, probably they're going to turn another color. But the pillars of the green policy of the European Union is the transition to renewable energies, the decarbonization transition to electric cars, and basically the increase of the digital economy. These three arenas that have strategic requirements, and they require these strategic minerals, and that are huge, and not only minerals, but also fossil fuels. So I think it is quite important and significant to mention this, because when we start doing all the doing all the additions of what the European Union is trying to do, and these are compared to what is being said by chemical engineers about the reserves, then these counts do not match. Because this colonial voracity and this capitalist and ungrateful economy of the global north, right now they have an intensification of extractivism and all the colonial issues that Fadel mentioned. So I think it is important to take this into account, and also these rearmed issues that are happening. For instance, in Gaza, I never thought that we could have a TV genocide. What is also happening is that there is domestication or operations like of threats that is important to take into account. I think this has been very important, and I concur with the fact that the possible transition that we can have in the global south is the one that Fadel pointed out, but I also think that is the only possible transition that we can have in the global north, which means a decrease in the use of energy and materials by the global north. On the one hand, because there is no place for a great part of the people in the planet, and on the other hand, there is, and the same happens for the populations living in the global north. And I want to point out a few things that have to deal with these proposal of just the eco-social transition that we see from the eco-feminist visions that I would like to point out. From my own point of view, at least in my country, when we talk about energy transition, we are analyzing and we are also working from the perspective of decarbonization, as well as the introduction of new technologies, green hydrogen, etc. From my standpoint, with several proposals that are still science fiction and not much of the reality, we are proposing that the just transition that is disconnected with the needs, the human needs that we need to meet, which means that this is quite timely, as it was mentioned, there is no energy transition, in my opinion, that we can do this alone if we do not talk about food, care, housing. So what we are talking about here is not only about the energy transition per se, but how we can transit from a model of death to another model that is actually, to me, in my opinion, the key of transition. Therefore, transition is not only a technological transition. This is about a transition on how to live in the world and how to be and live in the world. So on the one hand, we have all these physical borders and the access to the assets or goods that we are part of. And also we have all about human beings, and human beings are vulnerable beings. If a human being is vulnerable, it means that he has a being that has needs, a need for food, housing, need for water, of minimum access to energy, and the need to adequate care for the life cycle, because in childhood or adulthood or when in seniority, you cannot live without being cared for. So what I'm trying to say is that the fact of being born, this does not exist per se. This is a possible life, and for this to become possible and to become certain, we needed to guarantee the coverage of all needs. From the ecofeminist proposals, we propose that the just ecological transition, which requires a circle where we place the physical borders of the planet, and underneath, and within the other circle where we place the needs that we human beings have in order to be alive and in good conditions. So we say, okay, between those needs and these needs between the floor and ceiling, there is a space where we should have all the human ways to guarantee above what we need and underneath the physical limits of the planet that have already been surpassed because of climate change and biodiversity, etc. Therefore, a just ecological transition and an eco-social transition that is just from our standpoint, that would be a process that should be well planned, well desired, that may guarantee the minimum conditions of existence for everyone within a context of material contraction, and taking into account that we intend for this process to last for the future generations. I think it is extremely important to do it this way because we have, as I think, we have to place in the agenda all the ecological crisis and the concrete needs of people. We are 8 billion people in the planet. If the just energy transition aspire to cover or to try to cover what we've done with oil and with clean energies, what happens is that the level of deep predation of these minerals, when they are extracted, they are sacrificing lives in huge amounts. And given the order and the relation of forces and the power that exist, those that are going to be outside of the coverage, that would be the poor and the poor communities. In my country, we're talking about a just energy transition. Last year, the two large companies, oil companies, that they declared that they had the greatest benefits that they have ever had, 58 billion euros. However, these are two companies that are responsible for extractivism and destruction of the territory that is huge in Latin American territories and in other countries. And in my country, they cut off the electricity to those people that cannot pay that. So what I mean is that these are economic interests that destroy the global south and all the people that are part of the global south. That's why we call it global south, that these impoverished populations within the rich territories, what they do somehow is to make more precarious their lives and to forget about those lives. So I think it is important that we place in the framework that this matter of needs. I'm truly concerned if we talk in macro terms, that we should actually count these in the millions of euros. And in that bar of measuring the money, we must also take into account the concrete lives that need to meet their needs. Right now, I'm going to be very broad again, that the rich Europe, as well as the US or Australia region, right now, the European region, they are undergoing a process of growth of fascism, which is concerning, because it's worrisome, because this not allow for migrants to enter. Right now in Gibraltar, this is becoming a common pit and this wall that does not allow them to enter. They have been expelled, and because of climate change, they cannot live in several places because the fishermen that used to fish is actually caught by the European fishermen. And these walls opened and closed every day so that they can extract the food, fish, minerals. And this is not only food, fish, and energy, but this all is also open. This walls open for so many immigrants, especially women, that they are working from home, they are sustaining life every day as domestic workers or in their homes. So there is a great extractivism, not only in terms of minerals and energies, but also in terms of biodiversity and time work and people who are extracted from their territories and their place to work at the service of the of the rich, because this rich world has also a huge crisis of care. Well, I was given 15 minutes. I don't want to extend any longer, but I wanted to call your attention about these things because I think that right now, separating and not having a more global vision of what is at risk, we have to aim to new solutions with those that have to deal with food and care. I think it is also necessary to make the entire map of what sustains life at the same time. In my own opinion, I think it is important to think through these solutions, taking into account the inevitable material contraction of the global economy. So whether we want it or not, we are going to live with less minerals, resources from the earth, and energy globally. If we make or let the market to be the way they are acting, as Fadl say, that they are going to keep guiding without regulating resources, we know what is going to happen. Those that have the money to pay and they have the right to overconsume whatever they do, they can do that. But those in poverty, they will not even have the basic needs. They will not be able to cover the basic needs. So I think that this should be managed. And what is being proposed about Pan-Africanism and also the alliances among the countries of the Global South, and also the alliances with those social and political agents of the northern of the global north that wanted to accompany that path. So, okay, I'm going to stop here to not to exceed those 50 minutes. And thank you so much. I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to share with you and also to listen to the previous presentations. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I had a 30-slide presentation, but I think that because of time constraints and to follow the dynamics, I just would like to mention a few things, and I would like to complement or supplement what has been already presented. When we talk about transition, basically this has this new perspective. This is also a perspective of the South economies that invited to make new proposals. And the things that have been going on right now is deepening into these issues, which is the non-recognition of the planetary borders that we have, of the limits that we have. There is nothing more disconnected in life than the economy. Probably sometimes we even talk about not only economy, but also biology, etc. But economy starts from that ecologic complexity. Also, climate crisis has its own nuances, that deep extraction that the economy does on those limits. And although they have not been quantified, now they are very, very quantified actually. And this was actually released last year in this publication about the limits that we are exceeding worldwide. And as you said, we needed to negotiate. This is are biophysical limits that we have met. But the economy still talked about an unlimited growth, and this is based on competitiveness accumulation and basically that technological optimism. When they talk that we are going to be able to reach basically doing the same thing over and over, but in a more sustainable way. And because there is no in global environmental governance, there is an individual vision that every country wants to grow, but is a strategy for the common world. In the end, we are destroying the planet. So this is what's happening in the international conferences. This is like a big show where nothing happens for a collective vision for the planet. In that order of ideas, another concept that we are working on is the concept of just transition. And this is very important because when we talk about just or fair, then we are talking about many concepts. What is justice in this concept? Does it have to deal with a historical matter or probably something bad, something good? This is not just about a picture. We've been impoverished, as it was mentioned before. These countries have become impoverished, and historically, how these countries can solve these problems in terms of justice? How do we remediate that? How do we heal this? Because this is not only about money, these are many, many factors. And also the issue of who are deciding this transition. How do we include the locals, the communities, and looking for into a different transition. Perhaps the possibility of thinking other possible resources where we are seeing that there is a very colonial view, basically with these ideas and that the recognition of the limits of the planet is very important. Also, justice is, as we said, based on recognizing all these that we have mentioned before. We started working in Colombia, a research line that's called Diverse Economies for Life. This is inspired in a country like Colombia. In class, I always talk about Colombia, which is a diverse country. And I talk about a diverse country, not only in terms of ecosystem, but in those relations between the human beings and nature. We have a lot of relations that go beyond the relations of under the economy and are based on growth and on all those false things sometimes. And that becomes, and those things that are becoming insatiable. Many times in the south of Colombia, this does not happen. They don't have this type of thinking. That's why the right living or the good living or the good way of living, they start growing in those places. And they start from another well-being vision, which is a more independent vision. They say we are what we are, and the other one has to be another nature, not only a human being, but nature, that recognition of interdependence. So that's why we talk about economies for life. And in the global south, where we have authors like Maturana, Saavedra, Capra. In Europe, they also talk about the concept of light as an anti-systemic life. So when they talk about the economies, that they have to deal with all the relations of human beings and nature that are aware of that interdependence and that systemic vision. And this is what we are talking in the different economies. So that's why this image comes up. This is part of a book that we are going to launch in the book Fair Trade in Colombia, that where they have this concept of bioeconomy. So in this concept of transition towards a sustainable transition, we are going to have economies that are going to be more sustainable. So the transition of economies that are less dependent on extractivism and the economy all emerges as a paradigm, but also as a concept of the European Union. The economy that is conceived there, this is an economy based on markets and technology. However, the ecological economy or the bioeconomy is taught as the economy of life and generational vision and the limits. And there's where we start our own inspiration, that the concept of economy has to go back to its origins, which is the ecological economy. And to have in this southern context, they have to deal with practices, as you can see here in the context, in the text, that have to deal with energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, and that are part of the studies for the economy classes. The diverse economies and other economies, we also have these economies for life, and to recognize about what is going on. This is not only about the prioritizing, but also to understand what is going on within the community, social, popular, people's economy, indigenous, and others. There's so many types of visions in terms of economies. They are not the same or they are equal. They don't want to be homogenized. They have this common vision, though, where they are trying to resist or to be reluctant to that vision of always. That is actually the big problem. In terms of capitalism, the vision of replacing everything. Economy and ecology, although I am an economist, I was attracted to this. This is the vision of biodiversity within economics. The greatest the capacity of adaptation. When we talk about the capitalism, this is to have that logic. When we have that logic of accumulating and capitalism, it's not sustainable in time. But there are many other forms that exist where have another vision, because the well-being is not based on the, accumulation and competitiveness. But those are the ones that have been going on so far. But they are actually being eliminated in all these areas. And this was part of the political issues around the policies of the state. But we can have a more sustainable vision within the economies, and to look into these diverse economies, these fundamental possibilities, so that this system per se becomes more resilient. Also, talking about anti-capitalism is talking about taking the role or the main role of capitalism aside. It's that kind of vision of having this dual vision, and also not only walking away from capitalism, but also to get into these other visions. And this is actually happening in many places, and they keep emerging. There is also the logic of many human beings that want other type of relations upon the territories. In fact, they go, they can they settle, they become more independent. This is actually happening there, but sometimes there is no political vision that provides a framework for everything. Let me see the timing. To wrap up, there is a quote that I always mention in class. Yeah, my hope is Colombia. Sometimes there is a text that was called this topic of Colombia. This is a vision of a country that is quite complex but diverse, but also simplifies in the political and economic matters. And one of the most violent countries and very conflictive ones. But how can this happen? Because they're so diverse and in terms of policies and economies. This is a little bit of the vision what I'm trying to say here is that we have a big challenges, and how to discuss all these in such a world that wants to simplify, but I don't know how is this going to happen. I think that in the context of the climate crisis and complex crisis, we also talk about resilience and adaptation of complex systems. Resilience has to deal with the capacity of human beings to find possibilities and to become very creative in these type of moments where we see no way out. But in those moments is precisely becomes very utopic, and we can become more possible because that's where the concept of possibilities emerge. Only in those crises and situations that we can talk about creativity and how we can overcome this. So we have many, many possibilities. And I think it is fantastic that when we started launching the book, we started getting many emails from many places that stating that they were thinking about the same things. We have worked with Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, where they said, well, we are going in we're on the same page. We're going through the same path, that bioeconomy and other type of economies with many incentives. And it's precisely in the South where we have that capacity of thinking about the possibilities that many times in other countries have been eroded. So there is the knowledge, and sometimes we have this growth. But when we talk with these people, it's quite clear. Perhaps we're not going to talk about the growth because here we have many more complex things. Sometimes we don't talk about growth. This is not only about growth, but it's having another vision, another goal. So I would like to finish with that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, to all those who have presented, Fidel, Tata, Alex, Jajan, for sharing everything, all the perspectives that allow us to amplify a very complex scenario. And I'm talking about complex also because of the diversity that we have. We had the dialogue until 4:30, but also the intention is to have the possibility of seizing the attendance of these four wonderful speakers, perhaps for a few questions and to start the conversation rolling out of the different issues that you may have some concerns about. So I would like to open the floor for any comments, questions. I don't know if probably speakers also have any questions to us. That would be also important. The supportive economy, is there a 2.0 version of a solidarity economy? I think what we're going to do is a round of questions first, and then we are going to answer. So Moises. Basically, this is about the transfer of knowledge. I would like to ask. Yes, please, I need a microphone. Yep. Basically, is to talk from this holistic view of the speakers. How are you visualizing the potentiality that Latin America has in terms of those possibilities of energy transition? And clearly, not only referring to a solution of energy and technology, but more open to other dimensions that have been discussed here in terms of cultures, social, politics. This is the real possibilities that we can have in Latin America that has been fractured and that has been colonized in many ways. Because when we talk about decolonizing, we have, for instance, these Portuguese colonialists, we have the French or Spanish colonialism. How do we decolonize, and how we can bring together all these pieces and to become a Latin America with their own identity? And on the other hand, about this element of what my colleague mentioned about that ceiling of the planetary limits and that floor of the basic needs of human beings. How can we think through a proposal that can be capable, on the one hand, to be able to dispute with or to discuss with the global north, and also on the other hand to locate a reality in terms of that floor and that ceiling? Because when in Colombia we talk about degrowing, this actually was a lot of chaos because people thought, okay, we are not going to have access to energy and we are going to drop all this growth. Here we have talked about that degrowth in terms of social class and countries. So they say, okay, so how can we get to that middle point against that beautiful proposal that you are putting on the table, and that is going to be very difficult, is going to give us this gray hair? Well, I have. Okay, I would like to make also a question, and taking into account the experience of Fidel and Yayo, somehow there is our interest in terms of the political moment that we are living right now for the preparation or elaboration of public policies, and how somehow we can translate into concrete measures and thinking about that economy that puts in the center life, and sometimes the economy that puts in center the planetary limits and the complex relations, and that this entails bigger discussions. And most of the question is that perhaps right now we have these important elements from other experiences, international experiences, that we have to take into, because we have to take into account other experiences, all from the same economic perspectives that can be individual. If you wanted to answer the questions, please, you can come to the laptop and to the microphone to answer them. So please, yeah. So if, in addition to the presentations and the questions, if you would like to add something else about your presentations, about the ecologic ceilings and the social ceilings. This vision that we see within the limits, and sometimes, as you said, the challenge is how somehow we are going to relate these social and financial matters. Sometimes it seems simple. Sometimes the environment has become like a very luxury asset. So, and because of the social media and all that, we think, okay, why is this not possible? Because right now, we needed to still have to fix the education and health issues that we have in this country. So this is, we do not have to just to think that we needed, first of all, to take the poor outside of poverty and then start talking about environment. That's not the way it works right now. And this actually, we need to follow other paths. However, we have talked a lot about, especially conversations in COP that we have had. I don't know if you're aware of these discussions. This has to deal with the types of markets, because the markets are questioning right now, and there we have to think, what's the role of the state, actually? We say that we have the different actors in the productive sector, in financial sector, that are playing their own roles, but we need to change those roles. It's not only about the state having this big role, also the financial system should have their own role within this. The productive sector has their own role as well. So I think this is a call for all different stakeholders to change their perspectives and in terms of growth. And to find out, how do we do this? Clearly, this is not just about relations. This is about power and politics and technical issues as well. There are many political decisions, and sometimes it becomes technical because of economic technicism. But I think this is about a global governance and a political will that sometimes we lack, which plays at risk many of the questioning that we have. This is part of the geopolitical infrastructure, as it was mentioned. I think talking about the ceilings. Is to have a redesign, as it was mentioned, that we still have this design of colonialism, but the idea is to design economy in another way and to think about the new designs in general. Yes, please, very concrete. Yes. Okay, I was just going to mention to the question of what lines, but I think that Alex has already pointed out those lines with that idea of the diverse economies that compelled to think and to discuss about, it's not actually to really think about the complexities and how we dispute all this. And on the other hand, to think about the public institutionality from another point of view. I think that we need another state institutionality as well as a new local governance of institutions. And that new institutionality should go through the interaction with the sectors of the population in different diverse economies. I think that they have to break that dichotomy between the state and self-organization as if they were not compatible between each other. That's very important. It's necessary to rethink about a new institutionality. And then to say that something that Alex mentioned that I share entirely. Many of my colleagues with whom I've been working, I have Jojo, Kali, and some of the people in ICSA, they actually they talk about degrowth, which I'm not convinced of. I rather think to leave that term aside for the physical magnitudes of the model. That is the context, the reduction of material contraction, and to find new terms or new proposals for the political proposal on how we face that material contraction. The market is quite clear. This is about fascism, and it is that the population sectors that are protected by the political, military, and economic protection to allow them to access to anything that they want through market, leaving many people aside and in poverty. And there are other proposals. I remember when I heard France they said, well, it is, there is no term in Spanish of Spain. They were thinking, they said, not a good way of living, but like an enjoying way of living. That's what we wanted to say. We wanted to find that in a Spanish term, the good life, the Ubuntu. This is what we're trying to work around. The rethinking matter because it has very different logics. A life that is worth to be lived. I think that that's the way where we should go through because of this topic is about power and is also about the dispute of a cultural hegemony. So when Petro talk about the degrowth, I think that he probably this is like a joke, but there is a president and they go to this international stage, and at least in the Spanish stage, a debate started to open, and it never happened before. It is a debate because the Forum of Davos has used the term degrowth, and they have referred about an individual degrowth through the market line, that the poor have to adjust themselves to the rest of the market, and the rich can do whatever they want. We have all these tensions going on.
Okay, thank you. This is very very rich conversation. So I want to pick up on a couple of comments that my colleagues made and at the same time answer some of the questions and comments. First of all, when we talk about just transition, underline justice. And justice, as my colleagues have said just now, justice is about power. So we can't talk about just transition without rethinking the balance of power, which makes the geopolitical conversation extremely important. Number two, as you can see, I'm not talking about this geopolitical bargain, this rebalancing the global economy, really challenging the colonial powers. I'm not going to the president's ears and whispering secretly to Lula and Petro and other presidents. I'm saying this publicly because we need the push from the grassroots. We need civil society to understand that there is a clear, unique opportunity of decolonizing. We should not shy away from calling it what it is. This is about decolonizing the world. This is about the unfinished business that our ancestors managed to end the first phase of colonialism, and our responsibility is to finish the process of decolonization. And we should not do it in secret. We should do it in public, in the streets, and push our leaders towards this process of decolonization. Otherwise, they're immediately hijacked by the French diplomacy, the American diplomacy, to tranquilize them and to tranquilize the rest of us. And that is no longer acceptable if we're talking about a just transition. On the issue of degrowth, I know it's a terrible term to use, but the academic literature behind degrowth is very clear that we're talking about degrowth in the global north, reducing waste, reducing consumerism, ending the obsession with growth for its own sake. As they say, it's the ideology of a cancer cell, just grow and grow and grow. And of course, it's on our expense because it's the extraction from the south that feeds that obsession with growth. So we're talking about reducing waste, reducing energy consumption, material consumption in the north, but it doesn't mean we're talking about degrowth in the south. We're talking about a different kind of growth on focusing on quality of life, on the Ubuntu philosophy and so on. So that is very important for us. So when we design this grand bargain that I talked about, this just transition, we have to design it on our own terms. And if the material needs for this transition requires a massive amount of strategic minerals, which means extraction of strategic minerals from our countries. But this time, it has to be done on our terms. And that means that the volume of critical minerals on this planet is not going to be sufficient to create a just transition for us and to allow for extraction for the global north to continue their growth and obsession with consumerism. So once we reposition ourselves with an industrial policy on our terms, with our philosophy of life, with this just transition framework, we force the global north to give up their obsession with growth and consumerism, because there will be not enough critical minerals for everybody in the global north to have their own Tesla battery and their own toys to continue this consumerism. So this has to be part of this approach. And that's why I always insist that before we start this process of a grand bargain, of a transformation, we in the global south have to define the terms of this transition. We have to define the fact that some territories will not be mineable. Not everything is for extraction. If we have an ecological treasure that we designate untouchable, that means it stays on the ground. That means we, the rest of the planet, have to figure out how to live without those minerals, without those resources. And that means degrowth in the north. That means a different philosophy of life in the global south. And that has to be part of the process. When we say industrialization in the global south, to manufacture and deploy all of this technology, on whose back is this industrialization going to happen? On the backs of labor, on the backs of indigenous communities and mining communities? We have to define the terms of this new industrial era in the global south. And that means the profit share. Is it going to be going to the bankers and the financiers, or going to be going to workers or communities? The energy that will be produced, who's going to own it and extract wealth from it? Is it community owned, like in an energy democracy world? Or is it replicating the existing energy system of extraction and socioeconomic exclusion? The stronger we are as social movements from the beginning of this process to define the terms of this transition, the better the outcome will be. Otherwise, we'll fall in the trap of reproducing the same extractive and exclusive and abusive systems with the labor of a green transition.
This is quite complex. I think that I agree with what my colleagues have and the speakers have mentioned. I believe that if we tackle each question, I'm going to summarize these very shortly. For the first one about the solidarity economy, the solidarity economy, I think economy and solidarity must be very key terms to have a new bloc of nations. And this is indispensable to have this solidarity economy in the global south to be able to accomplish the decolonization and the changes of this system. In regard to Moises' question, well, I think that the industrialization is quite important. And when I talk about industrialization, I'm not talking about the industry that we have seen in Colombia so far. These are the industries that they can respect all forms of life, but these should be industries that should distribute their wealth, because we need equality and equity. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to create those funds, those resources that we'll need. We need also the alliances of civil society and everything around the trade unions and workers, and from the public side as well. About the last question by Luisa, also, I think that what Yayo has mentioned and my colleagues, when we talk about democratizing power, what I'm saying is to claim the public, because we have very good experiences from the community level, but we still have this huge gap between these examples and how living the different economies, and to have a beautiful life and to have a big gap with the public. So if we want for these forms of life and economies to reach everyone, then we need to claim the public aspect, and for the public to boost this transition, because it is expensive, it is huge, of a huge magnitude, and we need to address the communities, small communities, to entire nations, and this is great work to be done. And we need to do all this work on how we envision the public about all these matters. Just to wrap up, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. We brought here a gift, a present. This is Energies in Motion, and it is about the transitions in Latin America. And I would like to announce that at 5 p.m., we are going to have the relaunching of a book that is part of the history. So you are all invited to stay if you wish. And also we have some snacks that you can have, and to keep going the conversation, if you may. We can go also outside to the yard. We can keep sharing the snacks, the cake, everything. Just to wrap up this session.